Hey friends! Tonight we're drifting back to the muddy, uncertain days of the Middle Ages. But we're not visiting lords and stone castles or kings with golden goblets. No, this is a quieter, emptier, and much hungrier corner of history. We're entering a village where the harvest has failed. The fields are dry, the granaries are nearly bare. The bread is darker, smaller, if there's bread at all. And the people, they're not marching off to war or dancing at a feast. They're just trying to find something, anything, to eat. No spices, no salt, no second servings. Just bark soup, acorn porridge, and bread made from things that aren't meant to be bread. It's going to be a slow journey. We'll follow the peasant's day from sunrise to starlight, through frost-bitten mornings and empty bowls, and we'll see what remains when the earth gives nothing back. So lie back. Let the candlelight flicker. Let your thoughts fade like the last grain in the bottom of the sack. Because tonight, we're going hungry in the most medieval way possible. The last grain sack. A village watches the barn go empty. The air in Thomas's small barn was thick with the ghosts of harvests past. Dust motes, disturbed by the chill draft, seeping through the ill-fitting door, danced in the slivers of weak, late autumn light. They illuminated the emptiness, the bare, swept floorboards, the vacant corners where sacks once stood plump and reassuring. Today, only one remained. Agnes, Thomas's wife, stood beside him, her hands clasped tight beneath her thin shawl, her breath a small, white plume in the cold. Their eldest son, young Will, barely a man, reached for the sack. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if the sack contained not grain, but fragile glass. He lifted it. The hessian, coarse and patched, sagged limply. It was light, shockingly so. Light as a sigh, light as a prayer whispered in the dark. Will's face, usually ruddy from outdoor work, was pale. He didn't need to look inside to know. They all knew. The weight, or lack thereof, told the story more eloquently than any words. He carried it to the barn door, the pathetic bundle cradled almost tenderly. Outside, the hamlet of Oakhaven huddled under a sky the color of old pewter. A handful of neighbors had gathered, drawn by a silent, unspoken dread that had been growing for weeks. Old Man Hemlock, his back bent like a wind-tortured tree, leaned on his stick, his eyes, watery and knowing, fixed on the sack. Martha, whose youngest still coughed with a rasp that chilled the heart, pulled her children closer. Her gaze, too, was locked on that last dwindling hope. No words were exchanged as Will carefully untied the string. The opening gaped, a dark mouth revealing the meager treasure within. A few handfuls of barley, dusty, some grains shriveled, others unnaturally small. Agnes knelt, her fingers chapped and reddened by the encroaching cold, sifting through the grains. She counted them, not as a miser counts gold, but as a shepherd counts a lost flock. Each one precious, each one a tiny bulwark against the gnawing emptiness that was already making itself known in their bellies. The children, bundled in whatever scraps of wool they possessed, watched with wide, uncomprehending eyes. They only knew that the laughter had faded from the village square, that their mothers' faces were drawn, their fathers' shoulders slumped. The ground around Oakhaven was already hard. The late rains had been meager, and an early frost had kissed the fields, turning the stubble brittle and white. The plows lay idle, the earth too unyielding for their iron teeth. The familiar rhythm of the agricultural year, a rhythm that had governed life in Oakhaven for generations, had faltered, stuttered, and now seemed on the verge of stopping altogether. The woods, usually a source of nuts, berries, and small game, offered little. The trees were bare. their branches skeletal against the gray sky. And the animals, sensing the coming hardship, had retreated deeper, grown warier. This is how it began. Not with a sudden conflagration, not with the clang of alarm bells or the shouts of raiders. Famine did not arrive like a storm. It crept in like the evening mist, silent, insidious, chilling the bones and dimming the spirit. It began with the lightness of a grain sack, with the anxious counting of barley seeds, with the collective unspoken understanding that the stores were gone, the harvest had failed, and the long, dark teeth of winter were bared. It began with the silence of a village watching its barn go empty. A silence heavier than any stone, deeper than any well, a silence that settled over Oakhaven like a shroud. The last grain sack, almost empty, was a punctuation mark at the end of a season of hope and the chilling prologue to a story of survival.
Bitter bread, what peasants mixed to make it stretch. The aroma that usually wafted from Ilara's small cob-walled bakery was a comfort to the hamlet of Oakhaven. It spoke of warmth, of sustenance, of the simple, honest pleasure of a well-baked loaf. But now, the scent was different. It was still earthy, still carried the memory of yeast and heat, but an unfamiliar, acrid note clung to it, a bitterness that mirrored the growing anxiety in the village. Hunger, it turned out, was a harsh taskmaster, and it had rewritten Ilara's ancient recipes. Her hands, usually dusted with fine wheat flour, were now often stained with darker, coarser materials. The last of the good grain had been ground weeks ago, reserved for the ailing and the very young. Now, what little barley or rye remained was precious, and it had to be stretched, augmented, bulked out with whatever the desperate land could offer. Ilara would rise before dawn, the cold of her small cottage seeping into her bones. Her first task was often a journey to the edge of the woods, not for firewood, but for bark. The inner bark of elm or birch, carefully stripped so as not to kill the tree entirely, a desperate forester's wisdom, would be dried slowly by the dying embers of the previous day's fire, then pounded relentlessly with a heavy stone pestle in a wooden mortar. The sound was dull, rhythmic, a hollow thud that echoed the emptiness in their stomachs. The resulting flour was fibrous, almost woody, and a pale, dusty brown. Acorns, too, found their way into her mixing trough. Children, their fingers numb with cold, were sent to gather them from beneath the oak trees. These had to be leached, boiled multiple times in precious water to remove the tannins that made them impossibly bitter and indigestible. Even then, the resulting meal was coarse and left a dry, puckering sensation in the mouth. Pea shells, normally discarded or fed to the pigs, when there were pigs, were dried and ground. Dried beans, if any could be spared from the soup pot, were pulverized. Even dried nettles, carefully gathered with protected hands, were sometimes added, lending a faint greenish hue and a strange, hay-like flavor to the final product. There were whispers, too, of more desperate measures. Some spoke of adding sawdust, sifted fine, or even a particular type of dried, powdered clay, said to give the bread weight and a deceptive feeling of fullness, though it offered no true nourishment. Ilara tried to avoid these, clinging to the hope that something, anything, vaguely plant-based, would be better. The dough she worked with now was heavy, resistant, unlike the pliable, responsive dough of better times. It was a sullen gray or a muddy brown flecked with the various additions. It rose poorly, if at all, lacking the gluten that gave true bread its structure. When she shaped the loaves, they were dense, compact, more like bricks than the airy mounds of the past. The breaking process, too, was different. These loaves took longer to cook through, and the crust, when it formed, was often hard and flinty. The taste was the starkest change. The bread was bitter, earthy, sometimes gritty. It sat heavy in the stomach, a dense reminder of the hardship. There was no joy in eating it, only a grim determination to extract what little sustenance it might offer. Yet, the ritual remained. Ilara still baked. The villagers still came, their faces etched with worry, their coins, if they had any, clutched tight. The sharing of bread, even this bitter, compromised bread, was a deeply ingrained act of community. A refusal to let the bonds unravel completely. Hunger had changed the recipe, stripping away the pleasure and leaving only the stark necessity. But it had not yet, extinguished the ancient ritual of the loaf. However changed, however bitter it had become, each bite was a testament to survival, a gritty defiance against the encroaching void.
The soup that wasn't soup. Broth, bones, and boiled leaves. The fire was a miser's hoard of embers, coaxed into a reluctant glow beneath the blackened iron pot. Wood was scarce, each stick gathered with effort, each twig hoarded. Above it, suspended from a soot-stained hook, the pot simmered, its contents less a meal and more a whispered prayer for sustenance. Old Agnes stirred it slowly, her movements economical, her face illuminated by the faint, flickering light. The cottage was cold, the single room filled with the smell of damp earth, wood smoke, and the thin, almost transparent aroma rising from the pot. Inside, water bubbled sluggishly. It was the primary ingredient, the canvas upon which this meager meal was painted. Into it, Agnes had dropped a bone, a single sheep shank, a relic from a time when meat was not just a memory. It had been boiled many times before, its essence long since surrendered to previous soups. Now it bobbed in the water, a pale ghost, offering perhaps a hint of lingering marrow, a faint slick of fat that might rise to the surface if one watched long enough, hoped hard enough. It was more a symbol than an ingredient, a talisman against utter despair. Earlier, her grandson, little Tom, had returned from the frozen fields with a handful of withered greens, not the tender wild spinach or sorrel of spring, but tough, frost-bitten leaves of what might have been wild cabbage, or perhaps just hardy weeds that had clung to life against the odds. Agnes had washed them carefully, her gnarled fingers picking away the worst of the dirt, and added them to the pot. They would soften, eventually, lending a slightly bitter, greenish tinge to the water. A few precious grains of salt, saved from a dwindling supply, were sprinkled in, a luxury now. If they were fortunate, a bulb of wild garlic, pungent and sharp, might be found, its addition a fleeting burst of flavor that momentarily masked the blandness. This was dinner. This was the hope for the evening. The family,
Agnes, her daughter Mary, and little Tom would gather around the hearth, their wooden bowls cradled in their hands. Mary would ladle out the watery broth, ensuring each received a share of any floating leaves. The bone would remain in the pot, reserved for another day, another boiling. They would eat slowly, savoring the warmth as much as the meager substance. The heat of the broth in their bellies was a comfort in itself, a temporary reprieve from the gnawing cold and the persistent ache of hunger. There were no complaints. Words were as scarce as food, preserved for necessity. Little Tom, his eyes large in his thin face, might ask if there would be bread. Mary would shake her head gently, a flicker of pain in her own eyes. Agnes would offer a story instead, a tale of past feasts, of harvest celebrations, her voice a low murmur, a soothing balm against the harsh reality. The soup that wasn't truly soup was a ritual of patience. It was the act of gathering, of boiling, of sharing that held them together. It was the belief, however faint, that tomorrow might bring something more, a snared rabbit, a forgotten root, a neighbor's unexpected generosity. The warmth from the pot, the shared silence, the faint taste of something other than pure water. This was how they endured. It wasn't nourishment for the body in any real sense, but it was, perhaps, a sliver of sustenance for the spirit, a quiet defiance cooked over a dying fire.
The fields lay fallow and frozen, the gardens bare. What little the failed harvest had yielded was long gone. Now the people of Oakhaven, like countless other villages teetering on the brink, turned their desperate gaze to the margins, the hedgerows, the ditches, the sparse winter woods. Foraging, once a supplement to their diet, became the primary, often sole means of finding something, anything, to put in the pot. But the winter landscape was a parsimonious provider, and a dangerous one. Young Elspeth, her hands raw despite the scraps of wool wrapped around them, moved slowly along the ditch bordering a barren field. Her eyes, sharp and practiced from months of scarcity, scanned the frozen earth and tangled, dormant growth. She was searching for anything that might offer a morsel of sustenance. Nettles, even in their winter state, were a prize. The young shoots, if found nestled in a sheltered spot, could be carefully plucked, their sting a minor discomfort compared to the pangs of hunger, and boiled into a passable pottage, rich in iron, if little else. She knew to look for their telltale square stems and toothed leaves, even when frost limp. Chickweed, a low-growing plant, often dismissed as a nuisance, was another target. Its tender leaves and stems, if gathered before being entirely decimated by the cold, could be added to thin soups or even eaten raw, though their taste was bland and watery. Burdock roots, deep and tenacious, were a more substantial find, but required immense effort to dig from the frozen ground with a sharpened stick or a precious iron tool. The outer skin was tough and earthy, but the inner core, once boiled for a long time, offered a starchy, slightly sweetish mouthful. Dandelion roots, too, were sought for their bitterness, which some believed could stimulate a flagging appetite, or at least provide a change from the monotony of near starvation. The knowledge of what to gather and what to avoid was critical, passed down through generations, though sometimes imperfectly remembered in the fog of hunger. The forest floor, covered in a mulch of decaying leaves, might hide a few forgotten nuts, a hazelnut missed by squirrels, a beech mast. Acorns, as Ilara the baker knew, were abundant, but required careful leaching to remove their bitter tannins. Certain fungi, the hard, woody types that clung to trees, were sometimes boiled in the desperate hope they might yield some broth, though their nutritional value was negligible. But the search was fraught with peril. Hunger blurred judgment, and the resemblance between an edible plant and its poisonous cousin could be fatally close. Hemlock, with its feathery leaves and spotted stem, looked dangerously similar to wild carrot or parsley to an untrained or desperate eye. A handful of its roots or leaves, mistaken and added to the pot, meant a painful, agonizing death. Foxglove, with its handsome leaves, could be confused with comfrey when not in flower, its ingestion leading to heart failure. Nightshade berries, glossy and black, or deceptively red, might tempt a starving child, their allure belying their deadly nature. Even common plants, if consumed in large quantities by a body weakened by starvation, could cause severe digestive distress. Each foray into the frozen landscape was a gamble. Elspeth moved with caution, her memory replaying her grandmother's warnings. She sniffed leaves, noted their shape, the way they grew. The villagers shared information, a hushed exchange of what had been found, where, and what looked wrong. A withered berry might be examined by several pairs of eyes before being discarded or tentatively tasted. The woods and ditches, once places of familiar abundance in kinder seasons, had become a treacherous larder, offering just enough to sustain a flicker of hope, but always shadowed by the risk of a fatal mistake. The price of survival was eternal vigilance, and sometimes even that was not enough.
The farmyard, once a place of bustling life and comforting sounds, had fallen into an unnerving quiet. The cheerful clucking of hens, the lowing of a cow at milking time, the bleating of goats, these were sounds that had woven themselves into the fabric of daily life in Oakhaven. Their absence was a palpable void, a silence that spoke of a deeper, more profound hunger. The chickens were among the first to show the strain. As their meager rations of grain and scraps dwindled, their egg-laying faltered, then ceased altogether. The precious ovoids, once a regular source of protein, became a memory. Hens, scrawny and listless, pecked desultorily at the frozen earth, finding little. One by one, they had disappeared into the stew pot, a tough and stringy meal, but a meal nonetheless. The cock's crow at dawn, once a clarion call to the day, was now a rare and mournful sound, if heard at all. The henhouse stood empty, its nesting boxes filled with nothing but cold straw and dust. The family goat, Nanny, who had provided a small but steady supply of rich milk for the children, had long since gone dry. Her own hunger, the lack of fodder, had seen to that. Her ribs showed starkly beneath her thinning coat. Her bleats became weaker, more plaintive. There had been a day when Thomas looked at Nanny, then at his children's wan faces, and a silent, painful decision was made. The sound of her last frightened cry had echoed briefly, then was absorbed by the heavy stillness. Her meat, though meager, had provided a few days of something more substantial than boiled leaves. The small milking pail now hung unused on a peg, a dusty relic. Pigs, those efficient converters of scraps into fat and protein, were a luxury few peasants owned outright, but even the communal boar or the piglets some hoped to raise had vanished. There were no scraps to feed them, no whey, no windfall apples. Any animal that could not forage for itself or be sustained by the barren land became a liability, then a desperate, temporary solution to the gnawing emptiness. The single milk cow that wealthier yeoman families might have kept, or the oxen that pulled the plow, were also at risk. If the famine was deep and prolonged, these valuable draft animals, the very engines of future harvests, might themselves be sacrificed. The decision to slaughter a plow ox was an act of ultimate desperation, a mortgaging of the future for a few more days of survival in the present. The rich, earthy smell of cow dung, once a commonplace aroma of the fields and byres, faded. The soft, rhythmic sound of cud chewing, the warm breath of cattle in a cold barn, these too became part of the receding tide of normality. What remained was the memory of abundance, or at least of sufficiency, the memory of a fresh egg warm from the nest, the memory of milk, frothy and sweet in a wooden cup, the memory of butter, churned golden and spread, however thinly, on a piece of hearth-baked bread. These memories became almost dreamlike, a stark contrast to the current reality of the silent farmyard and the empty pot. The animals, companions, and providers had disappeared, their absence a profound testament to the severity of the famine, leaving behind a quiet that was far from peaceful, a stillness that resonated with loss.
The great stone walls of the parish church, St. Michael's, rose above the low thatched roofs of Oakhaven, a steadfast sentinel in a world unmoored by hunger. Its bell, a familiar voice in the valley, continued to mark the hours, call to mass, and toll for the dead, its bronze tongue speaking a language of constancy even as the foundations of daily life crumbled. For the starving peasantry, the church was both a spiritual anchor and, in theory, a source of material aid. In times of hardship, the local parish priest, Father Michael, was expected to offer what he could. The church held lands, received tithes, though these too dwindled when there was no harvest to tithe from, and was, in principle, a repository of charity. In the early days of the failing harvest, Father Michael unlocked the small parish storehouse. A few sacks of barley, some dried peas, usually reserved for the truly indigent or for church feast days, were distributed. He spoke words of comfort, urged prayer and penance, reminding his flock of Job's suffering and God's ultimate mercy. His sermons, delivered from the simple wooden pulpit, often touched upon the Psalms for famine. Our soul is bowed down to the dust, our belly cleaveth unto the earth. Arise for our help, and redeem us for thy mercy's sake. Further afield, the larger monasteries, like the Benedictine Abbey a day's walk downriver, had more substantial cellars and granaries. In widespread famines, these institutions often became magnets for the desperate. A thin, slow stream of Oakhaven's most able-bodied, or most desperate, might make the journey, hoping for a dole of bread or a bowl of thin soup at the abbey gates. Monastic orders, with their vows of charity, did try to provide. Almoners would distribute what they could, their faces grim as they saw the lines of gaunt figures stretching before them, their resources strained to breaking point. But even the wealthiest monasteries were not immune. Their own tenants failed to pay rent in kind. Their own fields lay barren. Eventually, their cellars, too, began to empty. The gates that once offered sustenance might remain closed or offer only a token, a sign that the well of charity was running dry. Back in Oakhaven, the small rituals of faith continued, imbued with a heightened desperation. Villagers knelt on the cold stone floor of St. Michael's, their voices weak but fervent as they recited the Pater Noster. Their prayers for daily bread took on an urgent, literal meaning. The Mass, with its symbolic offering of bread and wine, became an almost unbearable reminder of what they lacked. The host, wafer-thin, might be the only bread some had tasted in days. Father Michael, his own face growing leaner, his cassock hanging more loosely, did what he could. He shared his own meager meals, visited the sick, offered last rites with increasing frequency. He organized prayer vigils, processions, where the villagers, carrying crude wooden crosses and flickering candles, would walk the boundaries of their barren fields, chanting litanies, begging for divine intervention. Their voices, thin and reedy, rose into the cold, empty air, a fragile chorus of faith against a backdrop of overwhelming despair. The church offered solace, a framework for suffering, a promise of eternal life beyond the starved earthly one. But as the famine wore on, as prayers seemed to go unanswered, and the last of the charitable stores were exhausted, a quiet, heavy doubt could sometimes be seen in the eyes of the faithful, a silent question whispered by shaking mouths. How long, O Lord? How long?
The famine cake, a loaf made of desperation. It sat on the rough-hewn wooden table, a solitary disk in the center of the small, shadowed room. This was no celebratory cake, no sweet confection for a feast day. This was a famine cake, an object born of absolute necessity, a testament to the grim inventiveness of hunger. Its color was a dull, indeterminate grayish-brown, like dried mud or old ashes. Its surface was uneven, pocked and cracked, with no inviting sheen, no golden crust. It looked dense, unyielding, almost geological in its solidity. The ingredients were a litany of scarcity. The very last of the barley, not the plump grains of a good harvest, but the shriveled, dusty remnants from the bottom of the sack, had been painstakingly ground with a stone quern, a labor that took hours for a pitiful yield. To this was added bran, the coarse outer layer of the grain, normally reserved for animal feed in better times. Now it was a precious extender. Then came the additions born of deeper desperation. Dried pea husks, pounded into a gritty powder, the inner bark of an elm tree, scraped and pulverized until it resembled coarse sawdust, perhaps even a handful of dried, crushed acorns, their bitterness only partially leached by repeated boilings. Some whispered of adding chopped straw, or even dried, powdered leaves of certain non-poisonous weeds, anything to give bulk, to create the illusion of substance. There was no yeast to make it rise, no fat to enrich it, no sugar to sweeten it. Water, carefully measured, was the only liquid used to bind the mixture. The resulting dough was stiff, obstinate, difficult to knead. It felt more like clay than any dough meant for human consumption. It was shaped not with loving care, but with a kind of grim determination, patted into a flat, round form, because that was the easiest way to ensure it cooked through on the hearthstone, nestled amongst the embers of a carefully conserved fire. When it was deemed baked, more accurately, dried and hardened by the heat, it was retrieved, often with a faint smell of scorching and a harsh, unappetizing odor. The texture, when a piece was broken off, was its most defining characteristic. It did not crumble softly like good bread. It fractured, broke apart in hard, sharp-edged pieces. In the mouth it was dry, almost painfully so, requiring considerable effort to chew. It was gritty, the fibers of bark and husk resisting the teeth, the powdered acorns leaving a lingering astringency. The taste was overwhelmingly bitter, earthy, with an underlying note of something akin to burnt wood or damp soil. There was no pleasure in it, only the mechanical act of ingestion. This particular famine cake was to be shared among 6 people: Old Man Hemlock, his daughter Martha, and her 4 young children, their faces pale and eyes overlarge in the dim light. Martha took a knife, its blade dull, and carefully, solemnly, divided the cake into 6 unequal portions. The largest slivers went to the children, their small hands reaching out, their expressions a mixture of faint hope and learned resignation. The adults took the smallest pieces. The ritual of sharing, of pretending this was a meal, was performed with a quiet dignity. They ate slowly, methodically, each mouthful a conscious effort. No one spoke of its taste, its texture. No one spoke of the real bread they remembered, the soft crumb, the satisfying chew. This famine cake was not food as they knew it. It was a symbol of their endurance, a gritty, bitter embodiment of their will to survive. It was a loaf made not of flour and yeast, but of sheer, unyielding desperation, baked in the cold hearth of a failing world.
Children first. How families protected the young. In the hushed desolation of a famine-stricken village, where every sunrise brought a renewed awareness of emptiness, a primal instinct, fierce and tender, dictated a silent, unyielding law. The children must eat first. Whatever meager scraps could be found, whatever watery broth could be brewed, whatever sliver of bitter bread could be spared, these were guided with an aching gentleness towards the smallest, most vulnerable mouths. It was a sacrifice enacted daily, in countless humble cottages, beneath roofs that offered little shelter from the biting wind or the seeping despair. A mother, her own face gaunt, her eyes shadowed with worry and sleeplessness, would carefully spoon the thinnest of gruels, perhaps a few grains of boiled barley and water, into her child's mouth. Her hand, though trembling slightly from her own weakness, would be steady as she guided the spoon. She would watch, her heart a tight knot, as the child swallowed, a small, bird-like movement of the throat. If the child fussed or turned away, she would coax, her voice a low, soothing murmur, a sound as ancient as motherhood itself. Every spoonful consumed by her offspring was a tiny victory against the encroaching darkness, a sliver of hope she nurtured with her own diminishing strength. Fathers, their bodies once robust from a life of hard labor in the fields, now moved with a slow, deliberate weariness. They would return from fruitless foraging expeditions, their hands empty, their shoulders slumped. Yet if they had managed to find a single edible root, a handful of wintercress, or even a tough, stringy bird caught in a desperate snare, it would be presented not for their own sustenance, but for the family pot, with the unspoken understanding that the children would receive the choicest or least unpalatable portions. A father might chew on a piece of tough leather, softened by hours of soaking when no one was looking, trying to trick his own stomach into a semblance of fullness, while ensuring the last crumbs of a famine cake went to his son or daughter. These were the quiet sacrifices, made without fanfare, without expectation of praise. A parent might feign lack of appetite, pushing their own meager share towards a child, claiming they had eaten earlier, or that the smell of the cooking was enough for them. They would distract with stories, with gentle songs hummed in the dim light, trying to shield the young ones not just from physical hunger, but from the crushing weight of despair that permeated the air. They would mend and remend worn clothing, tucking children into shared beds under thin blankets, their own bodies serving as a fragile barrier against the cold that gnawed relentlessly. Sometimes, in the deepest solitude, when the children were asleep, a mother might be seen chewing on a handful of dried grass or the tough outer leaves of a wild plant normally considered inedible, anything to quell the painful contractions of her own empty stomach, so that she might have the strength to care for her young the next day. These acts were not born of reasoned calculation, but from a love so profound it transcended the body's own desperate cries for survival. The future, however bleak it seemed, resided in those small, fragile lives. Protecting them, feeding them, even at the cost of one's own slow decline, was not a choice, but an imperative, written into the very marrow of their being. Beneath the crumbling roofs of Oak Haven, in the dim, smoky interiors of peasant huts, this silent, daily heroism unfolded, a testament to the enduring power of parental love in the face of unimaginable hardship.
Eating what was once unthinkable. The descent into eating the unthinkable was rarely a sudden plunge. It was a slow, reluctant slide, each step taken only when the previous boundary of revulsion had been eroded by the relentless tide of hunger. What was once discarded, ignored, or considered utterly inedible, gradually, horrifyingly, became a possibility, then a necessity. The mind, in its desperate bid for the body's survival, began to reclassify the world. It often began with the edges of acceptability. Moldy grain, normally fed only to pigs or thrown onto the midden heap, was the first compromise. The worst of the blue-green fuzz would be scraped away, the remaining kernels washed, then ground into a flour that carried a musty, bitter taint. Bread baked from such grain was unwholesome, causing stomach cramps and sickness, but it was still, just barely, bread. Then came the food of animals. Bran, chaff, the coarse outer husks of cereals, normally considered fit only for livestock, were now painstakingly collected and added to the human pot, their fibrous bulk offering a deceptive sense of fullness. As the famine deepened, the lines blurred further. Animals not traditionally considered food in their culture, or those held as companions, entered the desperate calculus. The scrawny village dogs, once valued for hunting or guarding, began to disappear. Cats, beloved for their mousing abilities, met similar fates. Their meat, stringy and unfamiliar, was cooked in secret, consumed with a mixture of guilt and grim necessity. The thought of eating a creature that had shared one's hearth, that had perhaps been petted by one's children, was a heavy burden, but the cries of an empty stomach were a powerful persuader. Insects, a food source for some cultures but generally reviled in medieval Europe, might be considered. Grubs found in rotting wood, beetles, even ants, could be gathered, roasted over embers, and consumed. They offered a small, often bitter source of protein, but the revulsion was immense. Leather, too, became a desperate option. Old shoes, discarded scraps of harness, tough animal hides would be soaked for days, boiled for hours, scraped and chewed for what little gelatinous substance they might yield. The taste was acrid, the texture like gristle, but it was something to fill the void, however temporarily. Historical accounts from severe famines speak of even more desperate measures. Straw, chopped fine and boiled for extended periods, was sometimes mixed with other extenders to make a kind of pathetic gruel. Tree bark, beyond the inner cambium layer, was gnawed upon. Roots of plants known to be mildly toxic, but not immediately lethal, might be risked, the consumers hoping their weakened bodies could somehow process the poisons in exchange for a few calories. The most shocking reports, whispered in chronicles and confirmed by grim archaeological findings, tell of mud cakes. Clay mixed with a little water, perhaps some animal dung for binding, and baked hard. These offered no nutritional value whatsoever, but their weight in the stomach could temporarily quiet the pangs of hunger, a dangerous illusion that could lead to blockages and death. And in the darkest corners of famine narratives, though thankfully rare and universally condemned, lie the unspoken horrors of cannibalism, the ultimate taboo, a sign that the very fabric of society had disintegrated. For the peasants of Oak Haven, each new, unthinkable item added to their diet was a mark of their descent. It was a private shame, a public sorrow, a testament to how hunger could strip away custom, preference, and dignity,
leaving only the raw primal urge to survive. The world, once ordered into categories of edible and inedible, clean and unclean, had become a desperate free-for-all where anything that might offer a flicker of life, however disgusting or taboo, was considered with a grim, hollow-eyed pragmatism.
Dreams of feasts, hallucinations, folklore, and starvation. As the days of gnawing hunger stretched into weeks, then months, the landscape of the mind began to alter as profoundly as the barren fields outside. For the starving villagers of Oakhaven, sleep, once a respite, became a realm of tormenting delight, filled with dreams of impossible abundance. They would find themselves at tables groaning under the weight of food. Whole roasted oxen, their skins crackling and dripping with fat. Mountains of freshly baked bread, crusty and golden, with soft steaming interiors. Cheeses as large as millstones, sharp and crumbly. Flagons of ale, amber and frothing. And honey, thick and golden, drizzled over ripe fruits they hadn't seen since summer. They would reach out, their dream hands grasping, their mouths watering, only to awaken with a jolt to the cold, hard reality of their empty bellies and the dim, cheerless light of dawn. The memory of the dream feast would linger, a cruel mockery, making the day's hunger even more acute. These were not merely idle fancies. Prolonged starvation can induce vivid hallucinations, blurring the lines between the sleeping and waking worlds. A villager, weak and dizzy, might stare into the flickering embers of a dying fire and see, for a fleeting moment, a sizzling sausage or a bubbling pot of stew. The rustling of dry leaves in the wind might sound, to a desperate ear, like the crackle of roasting meat. These sensory tricks, born of an oxygen-starved brain and a body crying out for nourishment, were both a comfort and a curse. Folklore, too, played its part in shaping these visions. Tales of Cockaigne, that mythical land of plenty, where houses were made of gingerbread and rivers flowed with wine, were whispered with a new intensity. These stories, once light-hearted entertainments, became almost sacred texts, maps to an imagined paradise where hunger did not exist. Children, their small faces pinched and pale, would listen with wide eyes as an elder recounted these tales, their imaginations clinging to the images of food-laden landscapes, a temporary escape from the gnawing emptiness within. Perhaps they thought, if they were good, if they prayed hard enough, they too might find their way to such a place. There were also darker beliefs. Some whispered that the devil, or mischievous sprites, tempted the starving with visions of food, luring them into dangerous paths, or tricking them into eating things that were harmful. A mushroom that looked plump and edible in the dim forest light might be a poisonous illusion. The smell of baking bread on the wind could be a phantom, leading a desperate soul to wander lost and perish from exposure. Mothers, trying to soothe a crying child whose hunger they could not appease, would invent their own stories. They spoke of a time soon to come, when the fields would be green again, when the grain would be high and the ovens full. They described imaginary meals in loving detail, painting pictures with words, a warm hearth, a bubbling pot, the taste of sweet milk, the comfort of a full stomach. These were not lies meant to deceive, but rather incantations, spells woven from love and desperation, intended to conjure a future where food was not a dream, but a reality. The line between waking and dreaming, between reality and illusion, grew thin and porous. The world became a place where the scent of phantom feasts mingled with the bitter reality of boiled bark, where the stories of plenty were a fragile shield against the stark truth of starvation. The dreams of feasts, the fleeting hallucinations, the whispered folklore These were the sorrowful artifacts of a mind and body under siege, a testament to the profound ways in which hunger reshaped not just the physical form, but the very landscape of human consciousness.
The famine calendar, counting the days between meals. Time in the famine-stricken hamlet of Oakhaven had lost its familiar cadence. The sun still rose and set, the moon still waxed and waned, but the markers that once gave shape and meaning to the days and weeks had become distorted, warped by the lens of hunger. The peasant's year, traditionally measured by the agricultural cycle, plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, was now a desolate expanse, a calendar of gnawing emptiness. Days were no longer counted by tasks accomplished or milestones reached, but by the aching void in the stomach, by the shrinking intervals between what could loosely be termed meals. A meal might be a few mouthfuls of watery gruel in the morning, if even that was available. Then a long, hollow stretch until evening, when perhaps a similar portion or a share of bitter, bark-laced bread might be consumed. The hours in between were a slow, agonizing crawl, each one amplifying the body's craving for sustenance. A good day was one where 2 such meager rations could be found. A bad day, increasingly common, was when only 1, or none at all, punctuated the desolate hours. Market days, once bustling occasions for trade and social exchange, became painful reminders of what was lost. The stalls in the nearby town, if visited, were sparsely stocked, prices soaring beyond the reach of any peasant. The cheerful cacophony of vendors and buyers was replaced by a subdued murmur, the anxious faces of those with nothing to sell and nothing with which to buy. The journey to market, once undertaken with anticipation, was now a grim pilgrimage of fading hope. Church bells, which once marked the rhythm of prayer and community gatherings, matins, vespers, feast days, now seemed to toll with a heavier, more mournful tone. Feast days themselves, like All Saints or Christmas, arrived as hollow echoes of their former selves. There were no celebratory foods, no joyous gatherings around laden tables. Instead, these days, once anticipated with pleasure, served only to highlight the depth of their deprivation. A special prayer might be offered in the cold church, a plea for deliverance, but the festive spirit was a ghost. A week was no longer 7 days of varied labor and rest. It was a long, monotonous stretch of hunger, punctuated by the small, desperate hope that the next day might bring some unforeseen relief, a snared rabbit, a charitable offering, a rumor of grain in a distant village. Weeks blurred into months. The sharp demarcation of seasons, usually so vital to agricultural life, became less distinct when viewed through the haze of starvation. Late autumn bled into early winter, then deep winter, each phase bringing its own particular hardship, frozen ground making foraging impossible, deeper cold requiring more fuel for warmth, fuel that was as scarce as food. The villagers of Oakhaven began to track time through the visceral experience of their own bodies, the increasing weakness, the dizziness upon standing, the dull ache that never truly left their bellies. These became their chronometers. Memories of past meals, of flavors and textures now lost, became their temporal landmarks, oases in a desert of present want. Do you remember the harvest supper 2 years past, the taste of fresh baked bread with new butter? Such recollections were both a torment and a strange comfort, a reminder that life had not always been this way, a fragile thread connecting them to a time of sufficiency. The famine calendar was etched not on parchment, but on their shrinking frames and in their fading hopes. each day a slow tick towards an uncertain future, measured in hunger pangs and remembered feasts.
The grain riots, when hunger boiled over. For months, the hunger in Oakhaven had been a quiet beast, gnawing patiently, its suffering borne with a stoic, almost resigned endurance. There were murmurs, prayers, desperate foraging, but the deep-seated respect for order, for the authority of the Lord and the Church, held. But even the deepest well of patience can run dry, especially when the whispers begin, whispers of hoarding, of grain locked away in manorial storehouses while the people starved. It was in such an atmosphere, when desperation finally outweighed fear, that the quiet rage of hunger could boil over. It began not as a planned rebellion, but as a spontaneous eruption of collective despair. Perhaps it was a child's cry, weaker than usual, or the sight of yet another neighbor succumbing to starvation that tipped the scale. Young Thomas, his face usually gentle but now hardened by weeks of watching his family wither, found himself at the forefront. He hadn't intended to lead. He had merely voiced what everyone was feeling, a raw cry of, "We cannot let our children die while the Lord's barns are full." His words, hoarse with emotion, resonated through the gaunt crowd gathered loosely in the frozen mud of the village common. A spark ignited. Faces, usually downcast, lifted with a flicker of desperate resolve. Old Man Hemlock, leaning heavily on his staff, nodded grimly. Martha, her eyes blazing with a mother's fury, clutched a sharpened digging stick. A small, ragged group, perhaps 24 souls, men and women, began to move, not towards the barren fields or the empty woods, but towards the manor house that stood on the low rise overlooking the village. Its stone walls seemed to mock their flimsy wattle and daub huts. Its chimneys, even if unsmoking now, spoke of potential warmth and stored sustenance. Their progress was slow, shuffling, a procession of weakness rather than strength. They carried no real weapons, a few pitchforks, some staves, the odd rusty sickle. Their greatest weapon was their collective desperation, their visible suffering. As they approached the manor's outer yard, the reeve, a stout man whose own family was likely not untouched, but who owned his loyalty to the Lord, emerged. His face a mixture of alarm and disdain. He ordered them to disperse, to return to their homes, his voice attempting a sternness that wavered slightly before the silent accusation in their hollow eyes. "We need grain, Master Reeve. Our children are starving. We know the Lord has stores." The reeve blustered, denied, threatened them with the Lord's justice. But the crowd pressed forward, not aggressively, but with an inexorable, weary determination. A few bolder souls pushed past him towards the largest barn, its heavy wooden door bolted shut. The sound of a stone striking the wood, then another, a desperate, rhythmic thudding, began. Such riots were rarely successful in the long term. Even if they managed to break into a storehouse and seize a few sacks of grain, a temporary reprieve, the retribution was often swift and harsh. Lords did not tolerate challenges to their authority or their property. The ringleaders, if identified, would be seized. Some might be flogged, others imprisoned in a damp and cold cell. The most unfortunate, or those deemed most dangerous, could face hanging, a stark warning to others. Short, first-hand accounts, often transcribed in manorial court records, might simply read, "Item, John of Oakhaven, for unlawfully entering the Lord's granary and inciting others, was sentenced to be hanged." Or, "Agnes, wife of Will, for stealing 3 measures of barley, was set in the stocks for a day and a night." The grain taken, if any, would soon be consumed. The brief flare of defiance would gutter out,
replaced by an even deeper despair, now compounded by fear of punishment. The hunger remained, the systemic issues unchanged. But for a brief, desperate moment, the silent suffering had found a voice, a raw, collective cry against the injustice of starvation in a world where some had plenty, while many had nothing. It was a testament to the fact that even the most downtrodden, when pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, could find a desperate courage, a fleeting, tragic assertion of their right to exist.
Old Mother Ilara, who lived in a small, moss-covered cottage at the very edge of Oakhaven, where the cultivated fields gave way to the wilder tangle of the woods, was the village's unofficial herb wife. She was a woman of indeterminate age, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes holding a deep, quiet wisdom that seemed to predate the current troubles, or any troubles for that matter. While others foraged for sustenance, Ilara sought out plants for a different purpose, not to nourish the body, but to soothe its complaints, to trick the stomach into a semblance of peace, even if only for a little while. Her small garden, even in the grip of late autumn's chill, still held a few hardy survivors. Clumps of mint, their leaves frost-kissed but still pungent, feathery fronds of fennel, gone to seed, but with roots that held a faint sweetness, and the tenacious gray-green leaves of marshmallow, a plant she held in particular esteem. She knew the secret language of these plants, the properties hidden within their leaves, roots, and flowers, knowledge passed down from her own mother and her mother before her. When a villager, hollow-eyed and clutching a painfully empty stomach, came to her door, Ilara listened patiently. She offered no false promises of miraculous cures or magical feasts. Instead, she offered small, practical comforts. For the gnawing ache of an empty belly, she would prepare an infusion of marshmallow root. The root, when dried and then steeped in hot water, released a mucilaginous substance, thick and slightly sweet, that coated the stomach lining, creating a sensation of fullness, a gentle padding against the harsh contractions of hunger. It offered no calories, no true nourishment, but it could bring a temporary cessation of pain, a brief window of peace. "This will not feed you, child," she would say, her voice soft as thistledown, "but it may quiet the wolf within for a spell." For the listlessness and low spirits that accompanied starvation, she might offer a tisane of peppermint or lemon balm. Their bright, clean scents, a small olfactory uplift in a world dulled by despair. These too were illusions, but sometimes an illusion was all that stood between a soul and utter surrender. She knew of certain barks like slippery elm that could be made into a soothing gruel, not unlike her marshmallow preparations, to calm an irritated gut. She understood that sometimes the mere act of sipping something warm, something prepared with care, could offer a measure of comfort that went beyond the physical. She also knew the dangerous plants, the ones that mimicked the helpful ones, and she warned villagers away from them. Her knowledge was a bulwark against accidental poisoning, a quiet act of protection. She gathered her herbs with a reverence, understanding their power, both to heal and to harm. She would hang them in small bunches from the low rafters of her cottage, the air within imbued with their complex, earthy aromas, a faint, lingering scent of hope, or at least of endurance. Her remedies were not a substitute for food. They could not reverse the slow wasting of starvation, but they offered moments of respite, small kindnesses to bodies and spirits under immense strain. In a village gripped by the iron fist of famine, where every day was a struggle for the barest material existence, old Mother Ilara's humble preparations were acts of quiet dignity. She provided not nutrition, but a momentary illusion of it, a gentle easing of suffering, a tender acknowledgement of the body's distress. Her secrets were not of sustenance, but of solace, whispered in the language of leaves and roots, a fragile, folkish wisdom in the face of overwhelming loss. Shrinking bodies,
stretching days. The transformation was gradual, insidious, like the slow erosion of a riverbank by a relentless current. At first, it was just a loosening of the belt, a slight hollowness in the cheeks. But as the famine tightened its grip on Oakhaven, the changes to the human body became more pronounced, more stark, a visible testament to the invisible gnawing within. The days stretched, not in sunlight or activity, but in the amplified awareness of physical decline. Skin, once firm over muscle and bone, began to lose its elasticity. It sagged, becoming loose and thin like old parchment. Bruises appeared with the slightest knock, dark flowers blooming on pale flesh, slow to fade. The underlying architecture of the skeleton became more prominent. Cheekbones sharpened, eye sockets deepened. Collarbones emerged as sharp ridges beneath the thin fabric of worn clothes. Hands, once calloused and strong from labor, became bony. The knuckles enlarged, the fingers slender and weak. A pervasive, wearying lethargy settled over the village. Movements became slow, deliberate, conserving precious energy. Standing up too quickly brought a wave of dizziness, a graying of vision as the starved body struggled to adjust blood pressure. The world would tilt and swim, forcing a hand against a wall for support, a momentary pause until the faintness passed. Eyes, often dull and listless, seemed to forget to blink as often, staring out from hollowed faces with an unfocused gaze, as if looking at something far beyond the immediate bleak surroundings. The constant, dull ache of hunger was a companion, sometimes sharpening into painful cramps, sometimes receding into a background hum of emptiness. Sleep offered little respite, often disturbed by this gnawing sensation or by vivid, tormenting dreams of food. Waking was a slow, difficult process, the body reluctant to face another day of deprivation. Hair lost its luster, becoming dry and brittle, sometimes falling out in patches. Nails grew slowly and were often ridged and fragile. Wounds, even minor scratches, were slow to heal, easily becoming infected in bodies whose defenses were compromised. There was a peculiar coldness that settled deep within the bones, a chill that no meager fire could fully dispel. The body, lacking the fuel to maintain its internal furnace, struggled to generate warmth. People huddled together, seeking shared body heat, their breath misting in the frigid air of their own homes. The body, in its desperate attempt to survive, began to consume itself. Muscle tissue wasted away, leaving limbs thin and weak. Fat reserves, already meager in a peasant's life, were long gone. The body was forgetting its former strength, its resilience, adapting to an economy of scarcity, by shutting down non-essential functions, by shrinking, by slowing. Children, whose growing bodies demanded constant nourishment, suffered most visibly. Their growth stunted, their limbs became stick-like, their bellies sometimes distended in the cruel paradox of malnutrition. Their laughter, once a common sound in the village, faded into an unnerving quiet, their play replaced by a listless inactivity. The human body is a remarkably adaptable machine, capable of enduring incredible hardship. But there are limits. As the famine wore on, as the days stretched into an endless vista of hunger, the bodies of Oakhaven's people were slowly, inexorably, forgetting what it meant to be full, to be strong, to be truly alive. They were shrinking, adapting, enduring, even as the very essence of their vitality ebbed away.
The Lord's table, what the rich still ate. While the hamlet of Oakhaven withered in the grip of famine, a different reality, though perhaps more muted than in times of plenty, persisted within the stone walls of the manor house perched on the hill. The silence between the lord's well-defended dwelling and the peasant's crumbling hut was more than just a physical distance. It was a chasm of experience, a silence heavier, more suffocating than hunger itself. In the great hall of the manor, though the usual boisterous feasts were likely curtailed, some semblance of regular, substantial meals continued. The lord, Sir Reginald, and his family did not face the prospect of bark bread or boiled nettles. Their larders, stocked from wider estates or through purchases made with coin that peasants lacked, still held provisions. Perhaps the variety was diminished, the spices less exotic than usual, but food, real food, still graced their table. The morning might begin with manchet bread, made from finely sifted wheat flour, accompanied by a little cheese, or perhaps some cold, salted meat left over from the previous evening. Ale, weaker than festival strength but still nourishing, would be poured. Dinner, the main meal, even if less ostentatious, would still be a multi-course affair by peasant standards. A pottage, yes, but one enriched with vegetables from a better-tended private garden, perhaps with scraps of chicken or rabbit, thickened with oatmeal or barley that was not stretched with husks. Then a joint of meat, lamb from a carefully managed flock, or venison if the lord had recently hunted in his preserved woodlands, a right denied to any peasant. It would be roasted or simmered with preserved herbs. There might be preserved fish, salted or smoked, brought in from distant coasts or rivers. Wine, likely imported from Gascony if the lord was wealthy enough, or at least strong local cider, would be served in pewter or even silver cups. Sweetmeats, if available, might be dried fruits, or a custard thickened with precious eggs from the manor's own, better-fed hens. The contrast was stark, and keenly felt, even if rarely spoken aloud by the starving villagers. They knew. They saw the smoke, however thin, rising from the manor chimneys. They might catch a glimpse of servants carrying covered dishes, or smell the distant tantalizing aroma of roasting meat on the wind, a scent that was both a torment and a bitter reminder of the gulf that separated their existence from that of their masters. The lord's dogs, sleek and well-fed, were a visible insult to starving children. This disparity was an accepted part of the medieval world order, the divinely ordained hierarchy of those who fight, nobility, those who pray, clergy, and those who work, peasantry. Famine did not erase this order. It often amplified its harsh realities. The lord had obligations to protect his people, to dispense justice, but the obligation to share his personal stores down to the last crumb in times of universal scarcity was a far more tenuous concept, often superseded by the need to maintain his own household, his retinue, his position of power. Charity might be dispensed, a calculated measure to prevent outright rebellion, but it rarely equated to true solidarity of suffering. The silence from the manor was not necessarily of malice, but of separation, of a different lived reality. The clatter of cutlery on wooden trenchers in a peasant hut, if there was anything to eat, was a world away from the more refined sounds of dining in the hall. Upstairs, the conversation might turn to the difficult times, the poor harvest, the unrest among the tenants. Downstairs, in the village, the conversation, if any, was of survival, of the next mouthful, of the child who coughed through the night. The silence between these two worlds, the lord's table and the peasant's empty bowl, was a profound and defining feature of the famine, a quiet, unyielding testament to the deep inequalities etched into the very fabric of medieval life.
Dying quietly in winter. Winter, in the best of times, was a challenging season for the medieval peasant, but when famine stalked the land, winter became a relentless, silent executioner. The last meager vestiges of foraged food vanished under a blanket of snow or were locked away by impenetrable frost. The cold, always a threat, became lethal to bodies already weakened by months of privation. Death, in these circumstances, often came quietly, not with a dramatic struggle, but as a slow, inexorable fading. Imagine a small wattle and daub hut in Oakhaven, the wind whistling through the countless cracks in its walls, carrying fine, powdery snow that dusted the already cold earth floor. Inside, the air is frigid. The hearth, usually the warm heart of the home, holds only a few dying embers, too precious to burn freely, too weak to offer any real warmth. Huddled under a thin, patched blanket on a bed of straw lies an old woman, perhaps Alara's contemporary, her breath shallow, each exhalation a tiny, visible plume in the icy air. Her eyes are closed, her face, illuminated by the flickering light of a single tallow candle, a rare luxury saved for moments such as this, is peaceful, almost translucent. Her family, themselves gaunt and shivering, sit nearby, their silence broken only by the occasional soft cough or the whisper of a prayer. There is little they can do. There is no medicine to offer, no nourishing broth to coax between her lips. Her body, having endured months of gnawing hunger, simply has no more reserves, no more fight left. The cold seeps into her bones, slowing her already weakened heart. She is not dying of a specific disease, though opportunistic infections often hastened the end for the malnourished. She is dying of starvation, of exposure, of a weariness so profound that life itself becomes too heavy a burden to carry. A child, too young to fully comprehend the finality of the scene, might hum soft, tuneless song to themselves in the corner, a small, innocent sound in the midst of profound sorrow. Or perhaps they are too listless even for that, simply watching with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Snow, fine and persistent, might begin to drift down the smoke hole in the roof now that the fire is too low to create an updraft, settling like a delicate shroud over the unlit hearth. When the breath finally ceases, it is almost imperceptible. A stillness descends, even deeper than before. The candle flickers, casting long, dancing shadows on the rough walls. The living will cross themselves, murmur a prayer for the departed soul. There will be no elaborate funeral rites. The ground outside is frozen solid, making burial impossible until the thaw. The body will be wrapped in a simple shroud, if cloth can be spared, and kept in a cold outbuilding, or even in a corner of the hut until a communal grave can be dug. This was how many perished during a famine winter, not in a dramatic confrontation with death, but in a quiet surrender. They died in their cold homes, surrounded by the hushed grief of their equally starving families. The village grew still quieter, each passing marked by a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding of the fragility of life in such harsh times. The snow would continue to fall, blanketing the village, muffling sounds, creating a landscape of stark, monochromatic beauty that belied the suffering hidden beneath the thatched roofs. A single candle flickering over a still body, a child humming softly in the oppressive silence, the snow drifting into an open hearth, these were the quiet, reverent scenes of winter's final claim.
Church bells and empty stomachs. The bell of St. Michael's, the parish church of Oakhaven, was the village's heartbeat, its voice a constant in the shifting seasons of their lives. Its resonant clang marked the passage of time, called the faithful to prayer, celebrated unions, and mourned losses. During the famine, its sound acquired new, heavier layers of meaning, each peal echoing the hollowness in the villagers' stomachs,
each toll a somber counterpoint to their silent, desperate prayers. The Angelus bell, ringing thrice daily, at dawn, noon, and dusk, invited the peasantry to pause, to recite the Hail Mary, to remember the Incarnation. Once, this interruption was a welcome moment of reflection in a day of hard labor, a reminder of God's presence in their toil. Now, as the bell's notes drifted over the barren fields and into the cold, quiet huts, it often punctuated a day devoid of sustenance. The prayer for intercession, for grace, mingled with the acute physical reality of starvation. The Word was made flesh, the prayer proclaimed, a profound mystery that felt almost cruelly distant when their own flesh was wasting away. The call to Mass on Sundays and feast days drew a dwindling, spectral congregation. The path to St. Michael's, once trod with a sense of communal obligation and anticipation, was now walked with slow, weary steps. Inside the cold stone church, the air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and a faint, pervasive odor of illness. Father Michael, his own robes hanging loosely on his thinning frame, would elevate the host, the symbolic body of Christ, before eyes that saw in it not just spiritual nourishment, but a heartbreaking reminder of the real bread they craved. The chalice, holding the consecrated wine, seemed to mock their parched throats and empty cups. Yet they came. Faith, for many, was the last bastion against utter despair. The familiar liturgy, the ancient prayers, the promise of salvation and an end to earthly suffering in the life to come, these were anchors in a sea of misery. Their responses in the Mass were weaker, their singing, if any, thin and reedy, but the act of gathering, of participating in the sacred ritual, provided a fragile sense of continuity, of belonging to something larger than their individual suffering. Hunger in this context sounded like prayer itself, a constant, visceral petition arising from the depths of their being. Every empty stomach was an unspoken plea, every aching joint a penance. The bell also tolled for funerals, a sound that became increasingly frequent as the famine wore on. Each mournful peal announced another soul departed, another family diminished. The villagers would listen, crossing themselves, wondering who it was this time, the cold dread clutching at their hearts, acutely aware of their own mortality. The funeral Mass, with its prayers for the dead and its reminders of resurrection, offered a somber comfort, but it was a comfort tinged with the immediate, pressing fear of who might be next. Even the joyous occasions, like a rare wedding, were shadowed by the famine. The peal of bells celebrating a new union felt almost defiant in its optimism, a fragile assertion of life continuing amidst so much death and decay. The traditional wedding feast would be a pale imitation of former celebrations, if one could be managed at all. And always the underlying rhythm of the bells, for matins, for vespers, for the sick, for the dying, intertwined with the silent, constant rhythm of hunger. The church bells of Oak Haven became the soundtrack to their suffering, their chimes a spiritual counterpoint to the physical emptiness, and each note a reminder of faith, of loss, and of the enduring, tragic hope that somehow God had not entirely forsaken them.
The return of rats. In the intricate, often brutal, ecology of a medieval village, rats were a constant, unwelcome presence. They thrived in the margins, in the thatch of roofs, in the dark corners of barns and storehouses, always a nuisance, a competitor for precious grain, and a known, if poorly understood, vector of disease. But as famine tightened its grip on Oakhaven, the relationship between humans and these ubiquitous rodents underwent a grim transformation. Initially, as human food stores dwindled, so too did the rats' primary source of sustenance. The village, once a reliable smorgasbord for them, became a leaner, more challenging environment. Fewer spilled grains, emptier larders, and cleaner swept floors, born of the desperate hope of finding a forgotten crumb, meant a tougher existence for the rat population. For a time, their numbers might even have seemed to decrease, or at least they became less visible, retreating to more hidden burrows, scavenging more widely. But rats are survivors, adaptable and opportunistic. As the human inhabitants grew weaker, less able to maintain their defenses, and as the detritus of despair, unburied animal carcasses, poorly managed waste from sheer exhaustion began to accumulate, the rats found new, grim opportunities. They became bolder, venturing into homes with less fear, drawn by the faintest scent of something edible or by the stillness of the gravely ill. Their chittering and scratching in the walls, once an irritation, became an unnerving reminder of another hunger, parallel to their own. The villagers' perception of rats shifted. They were no longer just pests to be exterminated or driven away. They became direct competitors for the last pathetic scraps of potential food. A starving peasant might eye a rat disappearing into a hole with a mixture of resentment and a dawning, terrible consideration. The effort to trap them, once a matter of hygiene and crop protection, intensified with a new, desperate edge. Crude deadfall traps, snares made of hoarded string, or even a desperate lunge with a stick became common. And then the unthinkable. As other protein sources vanished entirely, as the taboo against eating such creatures eroded under the relentless pressure of starvation, rats themselves became a potential food source. This was a line crossed with extreme reluctance, accompanied by disgust and a deep sense of degradation. The act of skinning and cooking a rat, its small, stringy carcass offering only a few mouthfuls of rank, gamey meat, was a profound marker of desperation. Yet historical accounts from the most severe famines across Europe confirmed that it happened. Hunger is a brutal leveler of distinctions. The village cats, themselves starving and often having fallen prey to human hunger, were no longer effective controllers of the rat population. Dogs, similarly weakened or consumed, offered no help. The rats, in a grim irony, sometimes seemed to be faring better than the humans. Their smaller bodies requiring less sustenance, their omnivorous nature allowing them to exploit niches of decay that humans could not. When even the rats began to disappear, either through overhunting by desperate villagers, or because the village environment had become so utterly barren that it could no longer support even them, it was a truly ominous sign. Their absence, paradoxically, signaled the absolute nadir of the famine. If the rats could find nothing to eat, what hope was there for humans? The return of rats, initially a sign of declining human control and increasing filth, eventually gave way to their disappearance, which in turn became a silent, chilling indicator that the ecosystem of the starving village was collapsing entirely, leaving only the dying and the dead.
Famine laws and bread regulations. When famine gripped the land, it was not merely a local tragedy for villages like Oakhaven, it was a crisis that reverberated up to the highest levels of medieval governance. Kings, lords, and town councils were compelled to respond, not always out of pure altruism, but from a pragmatic need to maintain order, protect revenue streams, dead peasants pay no taxes, and prevent the kind of widespread social unrest that could threaten their power. Their responses often took the form of famine laws and bread regulations.
edicts that, while perhaps well-intentioned on paper, frequently failed to alleviate the suffering of the poorest and sometimes even exacerbated their plight. One of the most common responses was the attempt to control prices, particularly for grain and bread. As scarcity drove prices skyward, authorities might issue decrees setting maximum prices, hoping to prevent unjust profiteering. The assize of bread and ale, originating in 13th century England but with parallels across Europe, was a complex set of regulations that linked the price, weight, and quality of bread to the prevailing price of wheat. Bakers, like Ilara in Oakhaven, were in theory bound by these rules. However, when grain was genuinely scarce, price controls could backfire. Merchants might refuse to bring grain to market if they couldn't get what they considered a fair price, leading to even greater shortages in regulated areas. Or they might sell illicitly on a black market at prices far beyond the reach of any peasant. Laws against hoarding were also frequently enacted. Those suspected of stockpiling grain to sell at inflated prices or simply to ensure their own household survival while others starved could face severe penalties, confiscation of their goods, heavy fines, or even imprisonment. Local officials, like the village reeve or bailiff, would be charged with inspecting barns and storehouses. Yet enforcement was often inconsistent, subject to local power dynamics and corruption. The wealthy and influential could often find ways to circumvent such laws, while the small peasant, trying to hide a tiny cache of grain for their family, might face the full force of the regulation. Export bans on grain were also a common measure. A lord, a town, or a kingdom might forbid the sale of grain outside its borders, attempting to keep all available resources for its own population. This could provide some local relief, but often just shifted the burden of scarcity to neighboring regions, leading to interregional tensions and retaliatory bans. Furthermore, such restrictions could disrupt established trade routes that, in normal times, helped to balance out local surpluses and deficits. Governments also sometimes attempted direct relief efforts, such as distributing grain from royal or municipal granaries, or organizing public works for the destitute in exchange for a meager wage or a dole of food. However, the scale of medieval famines often overwhelmed such efforts. Bureaucracy, logistical challenges in transporting food over poor roads, and the sheer lack of surplus in a pre-industrial agricultural economy meant that aid, when it came, was often too little, too late. The burden of these laws and regulations and their failures almost invariably fell hardest on the poor. When bakers were forced to maintain a certain weight or price for a loaf, but could not obtain flour at a corresponding cost, they had little choice but to reduce quality, using the adulterants that made famine bread so infamous, or to cease baking altogether. Bread riots, like the one in Oakhaven, were often a direct response not just to hunger, but to the perceived injustice of a system that seemed to protect the interests of merchants and lords while peasants starved. Executions for looting or rioting were a stark reminder of the state's power, but did nothing to fill empty stomachs. Ultimately, famine laws and bread regulations were blunt instruments, often wielded with a poor understanding of economics and an insufficient capacity for enforcement or relief, leaving villages like Oakhaven to face the grim calculus of starvation with little effective help from above.
The itinerant poor, leaving home for food. When the last grain sack was empty, the last root dug, and the last hope for local sustenance extinguished, a desperate decision faced the starving peasants of Oakhaven. To stay and waste away in familiar surroundings, or to leave, to take to the road in a perilous quest for food elsewhere. For many, the instinct to move, to seek, to wander in search of survival, however slim the chance, overrode the deep-rooted attachment to their ancestral village. Thus began the tragic phenomenon of the itinerant poor, a drifting, skeletal population set in motion by hunger.
The decision to leave was never taken lightly. It meant abandoning one's home, however meager, the small plot of land that represented one's livelihood, the community of kin and neighbors, the familiar graves of ancestors. It meant stepping into the unknown, a world often hostile and indifferent. Families might try to stay together, but sometimes the able-bodied would go first, hoping to find work or charity and send for the others, a promise often broken by distance, hardship, or death. More often, whole families, or what remained of them, would set out, carrying their few pathetic possessions, their children weak and whimpering. Their paths were often aimless, guided by rumor and desperation. They might head towards larger towns or cities where they imagined, often mistakenly, that food would be more plentiful or charity more organized. The town gates, however, were frequently closed to them. Urban authorities, already struggling to feed their own populace and fearful of disease and unrest, viewed these wandering bands of starving peasants as a threat. Guards would turn them away, sometimes with threats, sometimes with violence, pushing them back into the barren countryside. They walked the cold, muddy tracks between villages, their feet often bare or wrapped in rags. They begged at farmsteads that had little to spare, at monasteries whose almonaries were already overwhelmed or empty. They slept in ditches, in abandoned byres, or huddled together for warmth under the scant shelter of a hedgerow or a lonely tree. The nights were filled with cold, with fear, with the sounds of coughing and quiet weeping. Each sunrise revealed a landscape that offered no solace, no sustenance. Some sought out the forests, hoping to survive on wild game, though poaching was a serious crime, or forgotten edible plants. But the forests in winter were as barren as the fields. They became specters haunting the edges of more fortunate settlements, their gaunt faces and desperate eyes a constant, uncomfortable reminder of the famine's reach. Illness, already prevalent due to malnutrition, spread rapidly among these wandering groups. Dysentery, fevers, skin diseases. The weakened bodies had no resistance. Many died by the roadside, their passing unnoticed, their bodies left unburied, prey to scavengers. The markets, if they could reach them, were places of torment. The sight and smell of food, however scarce and expensive, was an agony when one had no coin, nothing to trade. They might scavenge for dropped scraps, for rotten vegetables discarded by merchants, risking blows and curses. Some, driven by unbearable hunger, might resort to theft, a desperate act that could lead to brutal punishment if caught. For a few, the journey might, against all odds, lead to a place where food was available, perhaps a region less affected by the blight or a town with a more compassionate administration. They might find temporary work, a charitable handout, enough to sustain them until the crisis passed. But these were the exceptions. For most, leaving home was simply a prelude to a slower, more anonymous death on the road. Those who vanished from Oakhaven, the families who locked their doors and walked away, often became mere statistics, lost in the great, silent tide of famine-driven migration. They disappeared like frost in the morning sun, their stories untold, their fates unknown, absorbed into the bleak, wandering narrative of the itinerant poor.
The corner of what was once John and Mary's hut, a single soot-blackened iron pot, hung suspended over a hearth long since cold. It was not a large pot, perhaps just big enough to make a thin stew for their family of 4, but it had once been the center of their domestic life, the vessel from which came warmth, aroma, and the daily miracle of sustenance. Now it was an object of poignant symbolism, a silent testament to a hope that stubbornly refused to be entirely extinguished, even as the fire beneath it had died. The hearth itself was a circle of cold gray ash. No flicker of orange, no wisp of smoke, no comforting crackle of burning wood had disturbed its stillness for many weeks. Fuel, like food, had become an unobtainable luxury. The last twigs and hoarded turfs had been burned, and the energy to forage for more had long since deserted John and Mary. The pot, therefore, hung in a state of perpetual readiness for a meal that never came. Its iron surface, once regularly scoured with sand and water, was now dull, coated with a fine layer of dust that softened its stark blackness. A spider, sensing the lack of disturbance, had begun to spin a delicate, intricate web from its handle to the rough wooden beam above. John and Mary were gone. Perhaps they had joined the ranks of the itinerant poor, taking to the road with their 2 small children in a desperate last-ditch search for food. Perhaps they had succumbed, one by one, to the slow, creeping death of starvation within these very walls, their passing as quiet and unnoticed as the settling of dust. The pot remained, their last silent representative. It was as if, by leaving it hanging, they clung to a sliver of belief that one day someone, perhaps themselves miraculously returned, or a benevolent stranger, would rekindle the fire, would find something, anything to put inside. The pot had known better days. It remembered the smell of rabbit stew, rich with wild herbs from a time when John's snares were successful. It remembered the bubbling of barley pottage, thick and nourishing after a good harvest. It remembered the simple comfort of water heated for washing or for a medicinal infusion brewed by Mary. Its metallic skin held the faint lingering ghosts of 1,000 meals, 1,000 moments of shared family life. Now its emptiness was profound, a hollow echo of those lost times. Other abandoned huts in Oakhaven might have been stripped bare, their meager contents taken by desperate neighbors or scavengers. But this pot, for some reason, had been left untouched. Perhaps its very emptiness, its poignant readiness, evoked a kind of reverence, a respect for the silent hope it embodied. Or perhaps it was simply that an empty iron pot was of no use to anyone in a village where there was nothing to cook. It became a quiet metaphor for the famine itself, a vessel designed for nourishment, rendered useless by the lack of anything to fill it. It spoke of potential unrealized, of function thwarted, of a fundamental human need unmet. It was a dark, hollow mouth, waiting to be fed, but receiving only silence and cold air. Yet, in its steadfast presence, in its refusal to be taken down or repurposed, there was a strange, sad dignity. The pot that never boiled was more than just an abandoned utensil. It was a monument to the enduring, though often futile, human capacity for hope, a silent prayer for a fire that would one day burn again, for a broth that would one day simmer.
Hunger saints and famine superstitions. In the face of a catastrophe as overwhelming and seemingly arbitrary as famine, the medieval peasant's worldview, a complex tapestry woven from Christian faith and older, deeply ingrained folk beliefs, offered various avenues for seeking intervention and making sense of suffering. When prayers to God through the established church seemed to yield no relief, many in Oakhaven turned to more specific celestial advocates or resorted to ancient rituals, hoping to appease whatever powers, divine or chthonic, held sway over the harvest in human fortune. The invocation of saints with particular relevance to agriculture, food, and protection from disaster became more fervent. Saint Isidore the Farmer, patron of agricultural laborers, was called upon with renewed urgency. His intercession sought for a miraculous return of fertility to the barren fields. Saint Nicholas of Myra, known for his generosity and as a protector of children, and in some traditions, a provider of bread to the hungry, was another favored recipient of desperate prayers. Mothers would whisper his name over their starving children, begging for a miracle. Saint Walpurga, whose feast day in May was associated with the blessing of crops, might be invoked out of season, a desperate plea for her protective influence. Small, crude offerings, perhaps a single withered wildflower found in a sheltered spot, or a promise of a future pilgrimage if her prayer was answered, might be left at the foot of their images in the cold parish church or at a wayside shrine. Alongside these Christian practices, older pre-Christian beliefs often resurfaced or persisted more openly in times of extreme distress. Superstitions surrounding the famine were rife. Some might whisper that the failed harvest was the result of a curse laid upon the village by a slighted neighbor, a wandering beggar who had been turned away, or even by an accused witch. Others believed that malevolent spirits of the land, fairies, goblins, or nature elementals, had been angered and were withholding their bounty. To appease these unseen forces, small secret rituals might be performed. A crust of precious bitter bread, or a few drops of hoarded ale, might be left at a crossroads, under an ancient oak tree, or near a spring, offerings to the good folk, or the spirits of the place, begging them to relent. Strange rituals for rain, if drought was a contributing factor, might be enacted. These could involve processions, specific chants, or symbolic actions, often drawing on sympathetic magic, the idea that like produces like. Perhaps water would be sprinkled on the fields, or a particular stone, believed to have rain-making properties, would be immersed in a stream. These practices, frowned upon by the church as pagan remnants, were often carried out with a mixture of desperation and secrecy. The interpretation of omens became heightened. A flight of crows in a particular direction, the unusual behavior of animals, a strange dream, all could be scrutinized for hidden meanings, for portents of further suffering, or more rarely, a glimmer of hope. Fear of the evil eye, the power of a malicious gaze to cause harm or spoilage, might lead to the use of protective amulets or gestures. This blending of formal religion and folk superstition was not seen as contradictory by many peasants. It was a pragmatic approach to a world filled with unseen powers and uncertainties. When one avenue of supplication failed, another was tried. The saints in heaven, the spirits of the earth, the mysterious workings of fate, all were potential players in the drama of survival. Hunger stripped away theological niceties, leaving a raw, elemental need for intervention from any quarter. In Oakhaven, as in countless other starving villages, faith and folklore became intertwined tools in a desperate struggle against an invisible, implacable enemy, a testament to the enduring human need to find meaning and agency, even in the darkest of times.
Remembering the green months. In the depths of the famine winter, with the world outside Oakhaven locked in a monochrome of gray skies and frozen earth, the brightest colors were often found in memory. For the old ones, like Grandmother Elmsworth, who had seen many seasons come and go, the green months of past summers became a vivid, almost tangible sanctuary, a place to which her mind could retreat from the harsh present. She would gather her grandchildren, their small bodies thin and shivering even by the meager fire, and paint for them pictures with her words, tales of a time when the world was generous. "Ah, my lambs," she would begin, her voice thin but imbued with a gentle warmth. "You would not believe the summers we once had. The sun, a golden sovereign in a sky as blue as cornflowers, would wake us early. And the fields, oh, the fields of barley stretched as far as the eye could see, a rippling green sea under the summer breeze. When it ripened, it turned the color of spun gold, so heavy the stalks would bend their heads as if in prayer." She would describe the hay meadows, thick with clover and sweet grasses, the air alive with the buzz of bees and the scent of wildflowers. She spoke of the rhythmic swish of scythes during the hay harvest, the laughter of the men and women as they worked together under the warm sun, the shared meals of bread and cheese and ale in the shade of an oak tree. Her words conjured images of abundance, of a world teeming with life. And the gardens, she would continue, her eyes distant, seeing not the bare patch outside their hut, but the vibrant plots of the past. We had beans climbing poles, peas swelling in their pods, fat cabbages and sweet onions. Your mother, when she was a girl no bigger than you, Thomason, would pick wild strawberries along the hedgerows, her fingers and mouth stained red, sweeter than any honey. She recalled the sounds of those green months, the chirping of crickets in the long twilight, the contented lowing of cattle in lush pastures, the joyful shouts of children playing by the stream, their bellies full, their faces rosy. She spoke of the village festivals, of May Day dances around a flower-decked pole, of Lammas celebrations for the first fruits of the harvest, when there was bread for all and to spare. Her stories were not just a recitation of facts, but an evocation of sensations. The warmth of the sun on the skin, the taste of a sun-ripened berry, the smell of newly mown hay, the feeling of soft grass under bare feet. The children would listen, enthralled. For a little while, the gnawing hunger in their stomachs would recede, overshadowed by these vibrant images of plenty. Grandmother Elmsworth's stories were more than just reminiscences. They were a lifeline to a different reality, a reminder that the current suffering was not the eternal state of the world. They were seeds of hope planted in the barren ground of their young imaginations, a promise that the green months, with all their bounty, had existed once and therefore might exist again. She knew, with a wisdom born of long experience, that memory could be a powerful sustenance. It could not fill an empty belly, but it could nourish the spirit, keep the flame of hope from being entirely extinguished by the cold winds of despair. And so she wove her tales of remembered summers, her voice a soft thread of warmth in the childen air, painting the lost green world in all its glory, just enough to keep them dreaming, just enough to help them endure the long, bleak winter of their present want.
The grip of winter, which had held Oak Haven in its icy fist for what felt like an eternity, began almost imperceptibly to loosen. It was not a sudden, dramatic shift, but a series of small, tentative gestures, nature's quiet announcement that the season of death was yielding, slowly, to the promise of rebirth. For the famine-weakened survivors, these first signs of spring were almost too fragile to believe, yet they stirred a faint, cautious hope in hearts long dormant. It began with the light. The days, though still cold, started to lengthen, the sun climbing a little higher in the sky, its rays carrying a hint more warmth, a subtle shift from the bleak pewter light of midwinter. Then came the thaw. The iron-hard ground, which had resisted spade and plow for so long, began to soften. Icicles that had hung like crystal daggers from the eaves of the huts began to drip, a slow rhythmic percussion that sounded like a hesitant pulse returning to the land. The frozen stream at the edge of the village stirred, its icy carapace cracking, revealing the dark, flowing water beneath. In sheltered spots, where the sun's weak warmth lingered longest, the first tentative touches of green appeared. A tiny, vibrant shoot of wild garlic pushing through the cold earth, its pungent scent a sudden sharp promise of flavor. The brave, bright yellow of a coltsfoot flower, emerging even before its leaves, a splash of defiant color against the drab browns and grays of the winter-killed landscape. On the bare branches of the willow trees by the stream, small, furry buds began to swell, tight and silver, hinting at the leaves to come. Birdsong, which had been largely absent during the silent frozen months, returned in hesitant snatches. A robin, its breast a startling flash of red, might alight on a bare branch and offer a few clear notes. The distant caw of a rook, no longer mournful, seemed to carry a new energy. These sounds, small and scattered at first, were like the tuning of an orchestra before a symphony, a prelude to the fuller chorus of spring. For the villagers of Oakhaven, these signs were observed with a mixture of profound relief and weary apprehension. They had endured so much, it was hard to trust that the suffering was truly nearing its end, but the evidence was undeniable. The air itself began to change, losing its biting sharpness, carrying instead the damp, earthy smell of thawing soil, a scent that, to a peasant, was more precious than any perfume. It was the smell of possibility, the smell of future bread. Those with any strength remaining began to stir, to venture out, not just for desperate foraging, but with a new, albeit fragile purpose. They examined the softened earth, tested its readiness with a calloused finger. They looked to the skies, watching the clouds, praying for the gentle rains that would further awaken the sleeping land. The few remaining seeds, hoarded with almost religious devotion through the famine, were brought out, examined, counted. They were so few, and the hands that would sow them so weak, but the ancient imperative of the agricultural cycle was reasserting itself. The quiet rebirth of spring was not a guarantee of immediate plenty. The path to recovery would be long and arduous. The hunger would linger. But the changing season brought something more fundamental than food. It brought hope. It whispered that the cycle of life, though severely disrupted, had not been broken. The earth was stirring. The village, or what remained of it, began slowly, carefully, to stir with it. The first green shoot was a benediction. The first bird call a quiet hymn. Life, in its tenacious, indomitable way, was beginning again.
The famine did not end abruptly. Like its arrival, its departure was a slow, uneven process. The first tentative green shoots of spring matured, the painstakingly sown seeds sprouted, and eventually a meager harvest, the first in what felt like a lifetime, was gathered. It was not a bountiful harvest. The land itself seemed weary, the sowers weakened, the seed corn scarce. But it was enough to push back the immediate, gnawing threat of starvation, enough to allow the slow, painful process of recovery to begin. Oakhaven was a changed village. The famine had carved its mark not just on the landscape, with its overgrown, fallow fields slowly returning to cultivation, but on the bodies and souls of its inhabitants. There were fewer faces around the hearths. The old, the very young, the already weak, many had not survived the long winter of want. Those who remained were gaunt, their eyes holding a haunted, knowing look that would never entirely fade. Their bodies, though slowly regaining some strength, would bear the physical scars of prolonged malnutrition for years to come. Yet amidst the lingering sorrow and the profound weariness, something else remained. A quiet resilience, a deepened understanding of community, and an almost sacred appreciation for the simplest of sustenances. Consider Old Man Hemlock and Agnes, Thomas's wife, two survivors who had weathered the worst of the storm. They sat together on a rough bench outside Agnes's hut, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. Their teeth were mostly gone, lost not just to age but to deficiencies of the famine. Their hopes, once perhaps ambitious for their children or their land, were now simpler, more immediate, a day without acute pain, a night of peaceful sleep, the promise of a small meal. Agnes held a piece of bread in her gnarled, trembling hand. It was not fine white manchet,
nor even the honest, coarse bread of a normal peasant harvest. It was still a humble loaf, made from the new, meager barley, perhaps still with some extenders, because old habits of thrift, born of bitter necessity, died hard. But it was bread, real bread. She broke off a piece, a small precious crust, and offered it to Hemlock. He accepted it with a slow nod, his watery eyes meeting hers in a look of shared understanding that needed no words. They ate slowly, methodically, chewing with their gums, savoring each mouthful. This small act, the sharing of a crust, was imbued with a profound significance. It was a communion, a sacrament of survival. They had seen the absolute abyss, had lived through a time when a single grain of barley was a treasure, when a shared look of despair was the only common currency. Now to share actual bread, however humble, was an act of profound gratitude, a testament to their endurance. The famine left behind empty chairs, fallow fields that would take years to fully recover, and memories that would haunt their dreams. But it also left a legacy of shared suffering that had, in some ways, forged stronger bonds between those who survived. It stripped away illusions, revealing the stark fundamental importance of food, of community, of simple human kindness. The laughter might be quieter in Oakhaven now, the songs more somber, but there was also a gravity, a depth of experience that had not been there before. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Hemlock and Agnes finished their meager repast. They sat in comfortable silence, the shared crust a small, warm presence in their still fragile bodies. They were survivors. They had faced the void and had, by some miracle of resilience or fate, endured. And in that shared crust, in that quiet moment of communion, lay the essence of what the famine had left behind, a profound understanding of scarcity, an enduring respect for sustenance, and the quiet dignity of a people who had looked into the face of starvation and had somehow found their way back to the simple, life-affirming act of breaking bread together.
The Hollow Feast. Festivals without food. St. Martin's Day arrived as it always did, just after the last leaves fell and the first frost hardened the ground. The feast had once marked the end of harvest and the beginning of winter storage. In times of plenty, it signaled comfort. Salted pork, fresh bread, ale drawn from barrels, and baked apples stuffed with raisins. Songs were sung, bells were rung, and food was passed down long tables lined with wool blankets and sprigs of rosemary. But this year, nothing could be served. Not for lack of effort, but because there was simply nothing left. The church calendar demanded observance. The pulpit still named the feast. Banners still hung, stitched with symbols of the saint and the harvest, sickles, grapes, loaves, doves. A tradition could not simply be erased, yet the cloth hung limp in the wind, bleached by sun, dulled by soot, and fraying at the seams. A few children attempted a procession, carrying wooden antlers carved in years past. Some held old masks shaped like pigs, symbolizing the slaughter that never came. The parade wound around the square without music or cheers, only the sound of shoes crunching frost and an old bell swinging out of rhythm. The priest gave a sermon beside the hearth. Words of faith were offered to an audience wrapped in silence and cloaks. The offering bowl held a turnip, a sprig of dried sage, and a single cracked egg. Not alms, but gestures. Behind the pulpit, where feast day offerings once overflowed in baskets, the stone floor sat bare and cold. In better years, this day would end in celebration. Fat sizzling over flames, cakes sliced into wedges, spiced wine shared from clay mugs. Children would play games with apples strung on strings,
or search for hazelnuts hidden in straw. This year, the games were words alone. The children circled an empty barrel and recited verses that mentioned honey and apples, though few had ever tasted either. A pot still hung over the fire, as was customary. This time it held only water and a few boiled dock leaves. One family had saved the root ends of parsnips and contributed them, hoping to add texture. The pot was stirred, not to mix ingredients, but to keep the water warm. A single ladle moved around the circle. Each person sipped and passed it on. The village singer stood and began the feast day song. Verses painted vivid pictures of long tables covered in dishes, roasted goose stuffed with onions, rye bread soaked in dripping, dates wrapped in bacon, and eels swimming in peppered cream. None of it was real. Each line was a ghost, each note a memory. Yet the song continued. Eyes closed as words filled the space that food could not. Some smiled, not from joy, but because the melody offered something other than hunger. Others wept quietly, the sound masked by wind. By twilight, the bonfire dimmed. Embers crumbled into ash. There were no toasts, no drunken stories, no dancing in the fields. Only the creak of benches and the quiet nods of neighbors who had survived another day. A child poked at the fire with a stick, hoping for sparks. The adults packed the pot and ladle, placed the banner back into the trunk, and walked slowly home. The next morning, the square was empty. Footprints marked the frost like writing. The banner, still stained with soot, had blown part way down the post. No one rushed to fix it. The feast had occurred, but not in the usual way. There had been no food, no fullness, but the customs had continued. Not for comfort, but for continuity. To abandon them entirely would have meant surrender. To keep them, even in emptiness, meant hope. Even hunger, it seemed, could not starve tradition. It could only hollow it out and leave the frame intact.
Famine marriage, love in lean times. In years of plenty, marriage was marked with color, sound, and food. Bells rang loud across hills. Tables were set in long rows. Bread was blessed and broken. A roasted calf might be turned on a spit, its scent curling into the rafters of a barn hung with ribbon. Guests traveled from neighboring villages, bringing gifts wrapped in cloth, salt, eggs, dried herbs, perhaps even a small sack of grain. In famine, all of that changed. Unions still happened, but without flour, without wine, and often without audience. The rituals remained, but reduced to gestures. The word dowry was spoken in whispers, though most families had nothing to offer. Cloth was passed down, patched and refitted. Vows were exchanged in small corners of churches, beneath thatched eaves, or beside the forest path. A hand-fasting cord, made from 2 lengths of wool twined together, was still used. In some villages, 3 knots were tied to symbolize hearth, harvest, and health. That winter, the harvest had failed, and health was brittle, but the knot was tied just the same. Not as celebration, but as declaration. 2 people would face the coming season as one. Witnesses were few. A mother, a neighbor, the priest. Gifts were small. A wooden spoon, a loaf of rye kept in the cupboard for days too cold to stand alone. The loaf was cracked in half, one part saved, the other eaten. There was no sweetness, no feast, but the breaking of bread still bound the ritual. The church bells did not ring. The village could not spare the firewood to draw the crowd. No music played. Instead, the wind served as accompaniment. It whistled between bare trees, across empty fields, and through the chapel door left slightly ajar. The marriage song, traditionally sung by children at the feast, was recited from memory by an elder. The words were simple and rhythmic, listing herbs and spices that no longer sat on any shelf: saffron, mint, dried plum, pepper. The list was less recipe than remembrance. Once, wedding feasts lasted 3 days. Guests ate until buttons burst. Barley ale was poured freely, mugs filled again before they could be emptied. Jokes echoed from the rafters. Roosters crowed over the noise. But in the depth of famine, silence replaced celebration. A single candle marked the union. A shared blanket was the only new possession. There was no bridal procession, no music, no horse. Instead, 2 figures walked back across the muddy track to a home where the hearth barely smoked. A neighbor had left a basket on the doorstep containing boiled grain, a handful of beans, and dried herbs wrapped in cloth. That was the wedding meal. In many villages, the famine marriage became common. Quiet, practical, pared down. It was a contract of survival, a compact between families, a hedge against the long winter. What was joined in scarcity sometimes endured longer than what had begun in bounty. And in years to come, when the trees grew green again and bread rose high in the ovens, the memory of those unions remained, not because of music or cake or cloth, but because they had begun with nothing and grown roots in frost.
The salt cellar, preserving hope. Salt was more than seasoning. It was currency, medicine, and myth. In many villages, salt was stored in carved wooden cellars or small glazed pots shaped like scallop shells. These sat near the hearth, beside oil lamps or bundles of dried herbs. A household with salt could preserve meat, cure wounds, and flavor even the bitterest greens. In famine, the salt cellar remained, but its contents vanished. Coastal communities had better access. Inland, salt came by pack animal or cart, wrapped in oiled leather or waxed cloth. Even in good times, it was precious. In famine years, it was sacred. Some traders passed through offering coarse crystals in exchange for wool, firewood, or even shoes. Others refused to trade at all, knowing salt's power increased with hunger. Without salt, food changed. Turnips and barley gruel became bland. Dried fish spoiled more quickly. Pickled vegetables became rare. The taste of survival dulled into sameness. Meals no longer offered surprise, only sustenance. Tongues remembered salt, even when the hands could not find it. In one village, the salt cellar was placed at the center of the table during evening prayers, empty but symbolic. Elders told stories of saints who had miraculously salted whole barrels, of angels who wept brine onto bread. These tales offered a kind of flavor to the imagination. Alternatives emerged. Burnt dulse was ground and sprinkled into broth. Ashes were stirred into mash. None of these substitutions fooled the tongue, but rituals required something. Even the illusion of taste could comfort the mind. Some homes kept one pinch hidden, not to be eaten, but to be buried at the foot of a new seedling come spring. Superstition held that grain grown above salt would never rot. Others left a single crystal beneath the hearth, believing it would keep hunger from crossing the threshold. Still, the cellar remained in place. Dust gathered around it. No one dared remove it. In famine, people learned to live without flavor, but not without memory. The container stood as both relic and reminder. Salt, like hope, could vanish, but the place it left behind remained, always set, always waiting.
Famine altered the rituals of life, but none more than those surrounding death. In years of hunger, death did not arrive with spectacle, nor with sound. No wails echoed through village streets. No candles lined the thresholds. It came quietly, like frost creeping through the thatch. The first signs were small: a cough that no longer sought healing, a bowl left untouched. The weight of a body that once stirred in the morning now lay motionless. Death had always been present, of course. Even in good seasons, life expectancy was short. But famine reshaped its rhythm. What once took the elderly or the sick now claimed the strong, the young, the once hopeful. It did not need violence, it only needed time. The coldest months brought the stillest mornings. A neighbor would not emerge from a cottage at dawn. A chimney stayed dark. Someone would go to knock, but softly and not too early. Inside, a figure might be found curled in bed, eyes open but unseeing, hands frozen to a wooden spoon still resting beside the hearth. The fire had gone out hours earlier. There would be no dramatic announcement, only nods, only understanding. Coffins grew rare. The wood was more valuable burned than buried. In most villages, the dead were wrapped in cloth, often repurposed bedsheets or woven sacks. If nothing else remained, straw was bundled as padding. Graves were dug behind cottages or at the edge of frozen fields, wherever the ground was soft enough to receive them. Tools had to be warmed in fire to break through the frost. There was no time for elaborate processions, no time and no strength. Words were few. A candle was lit, a bowl was turned upside down beside the hearth to mark absence. In some homes, a piece of bread was left untouched on the table, set not for the living, but for the soul that had left, if there was enough bread to spare, that is. Possessions passed hands quickly, not through written wills, those were the domain of the literate and wealthy, but through silent gestures. A cloak folded and given to a niece, a carved wooden comb passed to the youngest in the household, a pair of boots left beside the door, taken by whoever had bare feet. These were not heirlooms of pride, but tools of survival. Yet each one held memory. A wool scarf might smell of time from years of kitchen work. A spoon might still bear the faint groove of a particular hand, always stirring to the left. These objects were not valuable in coin, but they became talismans, links to those who had come before and given all they had, even their last meal. In one village, it was said that a grandmother had sewn tiny messages into her apron hem, not with ink, but with knotted thread. 3 knots for each grandchild, 1 loose stitch for each year of hunger. When the cloth finally wore out, it was cut into strips and tied to branches near the graveyard, fluttering in the wind like silent prayers. Children received the most poignant gifts, sometimes just a story, sometimes a string of beads. One child was given a cracked mirror, once owned by a long-gone uncle. The reflection it held was cloudy, blurred, but within it lived the ghost of a face long remembered. Another child inherited a walking stick, carved with birds and vines, though barely old enough to walk unaided. Graves were unmarked more often than not. A stone here, a bundle of dried herbs there. Snow fell fast and even. It covered the earth, hiding the places where sorrow had been planted. In some villages, a single tree was planted for each lost villager, a custom that grew difficult when the ground was too hard, or when all the saplings had been burned for fuel. The words spoken at these partings were few, often repeated from memory. A verse from scripture, a line from a song, or silence. In silence, grief settled like ash, not loud, not hot, but everywhere. In years of famine, even mourning changed. There was no black cloth to wear, no extra candles to light, but what remained, the gesture of passing down, of giving what little was left to the next hand, carried as much weight as any eulogy. Inheritance meant warmth. It meant another day survived. Villagers became memory keepers in quiet ways. Recipes that could no longer be cooked were still spoken aloud. First nettles,
then oats, then broth. Even when the broth was no more than water, the words were recited like spells, bringing the dead briefly into the room. Old songs were hummed during chores, not always with tune, not always with joy, but always with memory. A village elder once said that famine had a way of folding time. The past clung to the present like a second layer of skin. What had been lost still lived in stories, in gestures, in the way hands smoothed a table or pressed dough that never rose. Even in hunger, people made space for remembrance. Not always with stone markers or burial gifts, but with quiet acts, setting aside the best part of a root for the youngest, keeping a fire lit 1 extra hour, placing a piece of cloth over the table even when there was no meal to serve. The dead gave no final words. Their absence became the message. They were not forgotten because their gifts remained in every gesture of care, in every object handed down, in every recipe half remembered. The famine took many lives, but it could not take the rituals of remembering. And in the silence they left behind, something lingered. Not just grief, but resilience. Not just sorrow, but the will to continue. A scarf passed down, a spoon held tight, a story told again. That was inheritance. Not wealth, not land, but love, woven into what remained.
When the frost finally cracked and loosened its grip, spring did not rush in, it crept. The land hesitated to green, as though unsure whether it was safe. Villagers, too, moved slowly. Hunger had taught caution. The return of color, blades of grass, pale buds on hedgerows, was met not with cheer, but suspicion. For those who had endured, the first signs of life brought relief, tangled with fear. Rain returned, but memories of failed harvests lingered. No one trusted the weather. No one planted without worry. Seed was scattered into earth as if into open hands, hands that might close or vanish. Barley and rye were sown with prayers, not loud, jubilant ones, but quiet, muttered hopes. Even the soil felt unfamiliar, like a friend who had once betrayed. When sprouts pushed upward, knees met dirt, and the sight of green blades caused a silence deeper than words. Not joy, just breath held and slowly released. The first bread baked in the village again was small, flat, with cracked crusts. It smelled sharp, sour. Some couldn't eat it right away, not for lack of hunger, but because the smell brought tears. It recalled what had been missing for too long. Bites were slow, mouths chewed reverently, remembering what it was to taste something that filled the body. People did not speak during those first meals. They listened to the creak of the table, to the birds returning, to the fire that crackled once more with purpose. Even water tasted different. Yet famine had marked everything. Children had aged strangely, taller than expected or much too small, bones too visible, teeth missing. Some walked with limps no one could explain. Others startled at shadows or panicked when a cupboard door creaked open with nothing behind it. They had learned to sleep with hunger and dream in scarcity. Elders bent further now. Their eyes, once sharp with laughter or scold, had dulled into the gray of watchfulness. They sat longer by hearths. They touched bread before eating it. They hoarded pebbles, small bones, cloth strings, whatever might be useful again. The famine had made collectors of them all. In every home, new customs had taken root. Crumbs were no longer swept from the table. They were gathered, placed in bowls, later stirred into soup. Leftovers, once ignored, became sacred. Bones were kept long after their marrow was gone, boiled into broth, dried, and sometimes carved into buttons or needles.
Nothing was discarded without thought. Some behaviors hardened into superstition. A spoon turned wrong side up on the table was bad luck. A cracked pot must not be used unless patched with ash and string. If a bird flew over the garden during planting, it was a sign to wait. If the fire crackled too sharply, rain would spoil the bread. Community rhythms returned, but more slowly. The bell at the chapel resumed its calls, morning, midday, vespers. Yet even its ring sounded hollow for a time, as if the air still remembered the silence. Feast days returned, but in new form. No longer indulgent, they became communal. A bowl shared was as rich a gesture as meat had once been. Singing resumed, but the songs had changed. The verses lingered on survival rather than glory. And when people danced, they danced simply. Hands clasped, feet slow, eyes closed. Some houses remained empty. A shutter clapped in wind where no one had returned. Others had new residents, nieces, nephews, neighbors who had lost entire families. These new households formed without ceremony. People simply moved closer, rearranged straw beds, adjusted the firewood. And some did not speak of it at all. Hunger had become a private country. Those who had walked its fields spoke with looks, not stories. It was too close, too large. Words felt too small. Yet others told tales, not of glory, but of endurance. They remembered how broth had been shared, how weeds had been gathered, how silence had been held like a bowl of precious soup. They taught the young how to identify chickweed and nettle. They showed how to scrape flour from old sacks, how to patch a cloak with bark thread. Knowledge, born in famine, became inheritance. No one returned to how it had been before. Even as grain filled sacks again and eggs reappeared in baskets, something remained changed. People hesitated before second helpings. Children asked before drinking milk. Candles were snuffed quickly to save wax. The memory of scarcity had carved itself into habit. And when the next winter came, not as cruel, not as long, villagers prepared with double care. Fires were built higher, larders packed tighter. Yet it was not only food they stored, but memory. Every loaf that rose reminded them of the ones that never did. Every stew rich with carrots and beans called back the water-boiled dock leaves. Every child's laugh echoed faintly with those who had gone quiet too soon. But they sang again. Not every night, not loudly, but they sang. Bread was shared not in celebration, but as a kind of vow, that what had been endured would not be forgotten, that each meal was a kind of ceremony, that survival, even silent, was sacred. The famine had not taken everyone, but it had touched everything. And still the earth turned, and the grain returned, and the people, though thinner, quieter, slower, stood once more beneath the sky. Spring had come again, not with trumpet or feast, but with soft steps, green shoots, and bread that rose.